easy, but that sometimes throws people want to start speaking, because some people want to do the precocious 12-year-old who's wandered to the front is. Some of you probably think I've walked off the set of Home Alone 1 or something, but I've taken the evening off the paper round to speak to you tonight. It's an honour to be on this platform because, for a very important reason, the voices we've just heard of people speaking from experience, because ever since this government has come to power, those voices have been airbrushed out of existence, ignored, and of course demonised. And one of the most important things the People's Assembly can do is give a platform to people, to be able to give people the ability to speak from experience, to tell people about what they're going through as a result of the outrageous policies of this unelected government. I also want to say this: I've got a very bad reputation amongst one of my old housemate who grew up in the Rhondda of milking, however tenuously, a local connection. But nonetheless, I'm going to do it. As my name suggests, my dad is very proud of his Welsh heritage. They can't remember whether they named me after Owen or Robert Owen. I'm going to ruin that goodwill by pointing out he's a North Walian. But nonetheless, very proud to be in this country again. For this reason, there's a very proud history in this town, in this county, and in this nation of people organising together against injustice and of standing against power. Whether it be the fact that this was one of the heartlands, of course, of the Industrial Revolution, and with it, the labour movement itself. Whether you think, of course, of the Chartists, the Welsh Chartists, it was here, of course, in this town, William Price was one of the great leaders of the Chartists. Whether it be just down the road in Pontypridd, the infamous or famous Pontypridd riots, when working people, miners, took to the streets and fought against the police and army who were sent to crush them on behalf of the mining companies. Whether it be the thousands who took part in the general strike. My granddad was one of them. His wages got docked as a result, and I still intend to get revenge for that at some point. Whether it be, of course, those who fought passionately and courageously against Thatcherism as it hammered strong and proud communities. These are our traditions. These are traditions of people organising from below, of standing up for their rights. And those are the traditions this People's Assembly stands in. I just want to make this clear. It's so important to make this clear. This isn't a talking shop. This isn't us just getting things off our chest. It's not a therapy session. The point of it is to build a grassroots movement. Whether it be, I don't know, St Albans to Glasgow, Manchester to Cardiff, Leeds to Bangor. I mean, I got invited to speak at People's Assembly in Finland. I've never even heard of Finland. But that's the point. Right across this country now, there are dozens of groups, 90 groups, 90 towns and cities where people like you are meeting like this. And the reason it's so important is this: the biggest party in the country isn't Labour or the Tories, or certainly not the Lib Dems. It's the people yelling at the TV every time George Osborne appears party. And we've all made a conscious decision tonight. We've all made a conscious decision tonight. We're not just going to keep yelling at the TV. We will do that because it is quite therapeutic. But we're going to actually come out and organise and fight back. I'm going to surprise some of you because I'm actually going to hand it to the Tories. You're going to stand back in awe of what they've done. Because they turned a crisis of the market and they turned it into a crisis of public spending. They managed to get away with this idea. The reason we're in this mess is because of overspending. Not just a myth, but they themselves backed Labour spending plans pound for pound until the end of 2008 itself. They've used this crisis to push policies they always wanted to get away with, but knew they otherwise couldn't without using a crisis. And then they claim victory, just as even on their own terms they failed. They said they were going to wipe the deficit out over the course of this Parliament. The underlying deficit is growing. Debt is piling, of course, day by day, week by week, month by month. And they've sucked growth out of the economy to the extent that this is the longest economic crisis, not since the 80s, not since the 70s. Friends, not since even the Great Depression. This is the longest economic crisis in modern British history. And the reality is this: there's as much sign of recovery in people's lives as there is a sense of shame in the statements of the Conservative Party. Because as things stand,
We're going through the longest fall in living standards since Queen Victoria sat on the throne of this country. For the first time since bombs stopped falling on continental Europe in World War II, the next generation is set to be poorer than the last. Since this government came to power, since the infamous Clegg, Cameron Lovin in the Rose Garden, the average person is £1,500 a year poorer than they were back in 2010. It's not to say it's not booming for some people, it certainly is. Like Wonga, they managed to celebrate a 36% increase in their profits. There's a good reason for that. There are rich pickings for vultures in austerity Britain. Every single month, 1 million families in this country depend on legal loan sharks to pay for food, for rent, for mortgages, to have clothes for their kids, to pay off other forms of debt. And then there's another booming industry, food banks. 500,000 people now depend on food banks. We have charities talking of parents having to choose between heating their homes and feeding their kids. We've got the size of school lunch portions shrinking because of budget cuts. This is the 7th richest country on the face of the earth, and apparently we can no longer afford to feed our poorest children. That is the shame, the reality of austerity Britain. And it goes further than that. We have now an army of 0-hour contract workers, hundreds of thousands of workers. It's a return to the Victorian era, when you had dockers who had to march to the yard in the morning and stick their hands up to actually have to ask for work that day. Many of them, of course, had to go off home. We have people working all hours, slugging their guts out for wages that just don't allow them to make ends meet. And again, since 2010, the number of people working for below the living wage has gone from 3.4 million to 4.8. A quarter of women now who are in work now slog their guts out for less than a wage that allows them to live. Again, this is the recovery this government is talking about. As we've heard so eloquently, we have hundreds of thousands of households being punished collectively for the failure of successive governments to build council housing, with one of the most unjust policies inflicted by a government in modern times, the bedroom tax. We have disabled people being humiliated, degraded, forced through the national travesty that is ATOS, support stripped away from them, forcing them into misery and despair. We have 5 million people now languishing on social housing waiting lists, millions of families forced into the private landlord sector with its extortionate rents and insecure tenancies. We have our NHS, our National Health Service, being sold off to the vultures circling above. Even now our Royal Mail, in defiance of the overwhelming majority of people in this country, friends, including Conservative voters. Friends, with such injustice, with such attack, one day all of us will be asked what we did to fight back. We will be asked, what did you do when people were going through the biggest squeeze in living standards since the 1870s? What were you doing when people were having to choose between heating their homes and feeding their kids? When people didn't have secure work? When people couldn't afford to make ends meet in one of the richest countries that ever was? And that's what we're here to answer. We're here to be able to say that we did actually do something to fight back. And the shame of this government, this is what they do. They've demonised and attacked the poorest people in society. We have the sight of them legislating against people struggling to make ends meet. MPs who a few years ago were fiddling expenses to pay for moats and second homes. And what they've done, this is one of the most cynical things this government has done. They tried to redirect people's justifiable anger at their ever-falling living standards, from the people at the top who caused this crisis to people's neighbours down the streets, the working poor against the unemployed, non-disabled people against disabled people, private sector workers against public sector workers, those living here against immigrants. If you're a low-paid worker, your wages being slashed by your boss, your tax credits are being slashed by the Tories. Who do they want you to turn on? The scrounger down the road. If you're someone, a call centre worker, a supermarket worker, who has no pension, with pensions decimated in the private sector, who do they want you to resent? The nurse next door whose pension is still intact. And this is where divide and rule ends. This is where it's ended up in. So it ended up in the sight of vans paid for by public money into mixed communities, spray painted with the sorts of slogans that belonged on National Front posters in the 1980s. The shame